in Colombia, the killing of the justice minister had pressured the government to try to arrest and extradite the country's major traffickers. But powerful and rich, they retaliated. Over the next 6 years, the country lived through a nightmare of death and destruction. The cartel targeted judges, journalists, politicians, policemen, anyone that they believed posed a threat. They also financed random bombings designed to wear away public morale. The United States maintained the extradition policy would work if the Colombians would just persist a little longer.
Sin embargo, tanto Colombia como los Estados Unidos
has extradited its citizens.
Chief of the DEA, Jack Lawn, came down to Colombia to defend the policy.
I think that it is effective.
Creo que es una medida eficaz.
And I maintain the belief in its effectiveness.
Y creo en su efectividad.
Because of the tremendous outcry
por el tremendo clamor que se levanta de parte de los traficantes mismos
against extradition.
En contra de la extradición.
I can say that the authorities in Colombia were trying to do what was the very best for drug law enforcement and what was the very best for their own government. But the impact clearly was one that the United States, in effecting the extradition treaty, did not anticipate.
The fact that there was a violent reaction to it indicated that it was perceived to be a really powerful weapon in this struggle. And dropping it, I don't see what you gain by dropping it. You're yielding then to the traffickers. I'm not saying that it's not important to try to save lives, but on the other hand, that means that if when someone puts a gun to your head, you just yield all the time. What's going to happen?
In one of the boldest attacks against the Colombian government, anti-government guerrillas, acting in partnership with the Medellin cartel, attacked the Colombia Supreme Court in 1985. All files containing pending extradition requests were destroyed. 11 Supreme Court justices were killed. In total, more than 200 people died. By 1986, there was no end in sight to the violence and no extraditions of the Medellin drug lords.
I believe that the cartels, by using their muscle, by using terrorist tactics, clearly won the day. They succeeded in forcing individuals in the government of Colombia to back away from what could have been a very effective policy. That being said, the officials who made that decision were in the line of fire, and they did the prudent thing. Was it a wise policy? It was a good policy. It was applied effectively. The results of the policy were bad.
With the violence raging inside Colombia and more pressure on their old roots through the Bahamas, the Medellin drug lords played a kind of hemispheric shell game, deftly moving their cocaine operations to places like Cuba, Mexico, and in 1984 to Nicaragua, where the Sandinista government gave them sanctuary.
They were going to fly the cocaine paste to Nicaragua to process it and then fly it out from there. We were ready to indict that and, in fact, had buried...
In the U.S., Dick Gregory was preparing a major indictment of the cartel. But Gregory was frustrated that the Colombians couldn't extradite the cartel leaders. Working with the DEA, Gregory helped devise an elaborate trap. But the drug war was about to collide with the Cold War.
Los Sandinistas, hubo un momento There was a time when the Sandinista government of Nicaragua offered to cooperate and help us traffic drugs. Pablo Escobar went personally to Managua in order to strike a deal which involved Barry Seal.
Barry Seal precisamente, pero eso fue un fracaso porque pues Barry Seal ya estaba.
But it was a fiasco because Barry Seal was already twisted, as we say.
Barry Seal was a former TWA commercial pilot who by the mid-'80s had made an estimated $25 million flying cocaine for Pablo Escobar and Jorge Ochoa. Unknown to them, however, Seal had been arrested and had cut a secret deal with Dick Gregory and the DEA to help bring in Escobar and Ochoa. Seal was now working for the U.S. government.
Barry Seal had flown to Nicaragua and had seen that they were opening plants to start producing the cocaine there, and that they were going to fly it to the U.S., and we were going to be able to prove the full circle.
A plan was hatched to have the CIA rig Barry Seal's plane with hidden cameras in order to collect photographic evidence of drug smuggling. Then Seal would lure Escobar and Ochoa to a third country where they could be arrested and extradited to the U.S.
We had hoped that this was going to bring down the cartel lock, stock, and barrel, and we had hoped that it was going to have a major effect on the process.
The flight to Nicaragua went off perfectly. The cameras worked. They caught these shots with Pablo Escobar and a Nicaraguan official, Federico Van, loading Seal's plane with 750 pounds of cocaine. That's Escobar on the left, Seal on the right. This was astounding evidence, and it flashed to the highest levels in Washington. The very day that Seal returned to Florida with his load of cocaine, Ronald Reagan's National Security Advisor Oliver North jotted in his notebook, "Photos show Vaughn and Nicaraguan troops, 750 pounds of cocaine." Within a few weeks, while law enforcement agents were still in the process of laying their trap, the operation was leaked to the press.
And the next thing we knew, we had the radio making a public announcement that this is what was happening, and we had to call Barry Seal back from in the air, because he was flying down there to accomplish this mission, and tell him that he better return home, that we were afraid we were going to lose our star witness.
I was outraged. This was an ongoing investigation by the Drug Enforcement Administration, and information was leaked for reasons that had nothing to do with drug law enforcement. No one had previously contacted us to ask our help, to solicit our cooperation, to even ask about whether we had undercover activities or undercover agents who might be in jeopardy. It was done solely as a political agenda.
Well, as the world now knows, I was deeply involved by that point in time in assisting the Nicaraguan resistance and in various policy initiatives in Central America.
Colonel North, please rise.
It has long been suspected that Oliver North was responsible for leaking the story. Until now, he has always denied it.
It became public as a result of a briefing to Congress. That's how the whole thing actually came out.
What do you mean?
Well, there was a briefing given to a United States senator, as a matter of fact, and it was shortly thereafter that this whole operation became a public matter. And it was after the operation was ongoing, involving the coordinated activities of various government agencies.
Did you brief the senator? Or?
I did.
What North told Frontline is that he was directed by, quote, his bosses on the National Security Council to brief Senator Paula Hawkins of Florida, a staunch supporter of the Contras or the Nicaraguan resistance.
And it was after that it appeared in the Washington Times.
It did indeed.
Senator Hawkins remembers the briefing, but insists that neither she nor any member of her staff leaked the information.
I was always under the impression that there were interests at work other than the narcotics war. The narcotics war was never the priority of the U.S. government. They were more concerned about fighting the godless communist conspiracy and the spread of communism in Latin America than they were about the extent of the narcotics trade.
At the time, Nicaragua was a major Cold War battlefield, a major focus of Reagan foreign policy.
They are our brothers, these freedom fighters, and we owe them our help.
The Reagan administration was supporting and directing the Contras in an effort to topple the Cuban-backed Sandinista government of Nicaragua.
You know the truth about them. You know who they're fighting and why. They are the moral equal of our founding fathers and the brave men and women of the French resistance. We cannot turn away from them.
While the Sandinistas were profiting from the cocaine business, there were charges that the Contras were doing the same, and that the CIA was aware of and condoned Contra cocaine smuggling to help raise money for the cause.
I've never known of a CIA employee to carry drugs in a suitcase across the border, but I have known other contract employees to have brought tons of cocaine into the United States.
Hector Paredes is a former DEA supervisor stationed in Los Angeles during the 1980s. He is one of a number of DEA field agents who believe that CIA contractors were involved.
I believe that elements working for the CIA were involved in bringing drugs into the country. And I more than believe it, I know specifically that some of the CIA contract workers, meaning some of the pilots, in fact, were bringing in drugs into the U.S.
But in 1998, the CIA published a report by its independent inspector general which stated that while there were many allegations in their files, there was no credible evidence of CIA drug smuggling.
We concluded that there was no institutional involvement by CIA, and there was no individual CIA case officer involvement in drug trafficking in the Contra operation during the period in which we reviewed the records.
But the HITS report did state that not all allegations were thoroughly investigated. It also revealed this letter of understanding between the Department of Justice and the CIA, which fails to list drug trafficking among those crimes CIA field agents must report to U.S. law enforcement.
Yes, there is a letter to the agency, but that doesn't forgive your responsibility and the responsibility of your officers in the field to report criminal activity when they encounter it. So it was a mixed message.
Questions regarding CIA involvement in drug smuggling may never be fully resolved. But what is clear is that throughout the 1980s, Central America was awash in drugs and drug money. And despite political rhetoric at home, fighting drug trafficking was not always the U.S. government's #1 priority.
I know every American parent concerned about the drug problem will be outraged to learn that top Nicaraguan government officials are deeply involved in drug trafficking. This picture, secretly taken at a military...
2 years after the aborted Nicaraguan operation, the pictures of Barry Seal were still being used as propaganda against the Sandinistas.
The Sandinistas will not stoop. This is an outlaw regime.
For many in the DEA, the use of the pictures would symbolize the long-standing clash between drug law enforcement and politics. The leak may have also cost DEA informant Barry Seal his life. In February of 1986, Seal was assassinated in Baton Rouge, Louisiana by paid gunmen of the Medellin cartel. The youngest Ochoa brother, Fabio, has been accused of masterminding the murder. Just last year, along with 30 others, Fabio Ochoa was arrested and charged with conspiracy to traffic heroin and cocaine. The U.S. government has requested his extradition to face those charges and the murder of Barry Seal. Fabio's not guilty, says his brother Jorge.
So who was responsible for the murder of Barry Seal?
Yo no sé.
I don't know.
Yo no sé quién.
I don't know who.
Today, Jorge and Juan David Ochoa say they are out of the drug business. In 1991, they negotiated surrender agreements with the Colombian government and served short jail terms. They were released in 1996. They were allowed to keep most of their land and money, Their old business partner, Pablo Escobar, was gunned down by the police in 1993. The only major kingpin who has ever been arrested and extradited is Carlos Lader, who is now serving a life sentence in the U.S. In 1985, his Danbury bunkmate, George Jung, was caught with 660 pounds of cocaine. He agreed to testify against Lader in exchange for a reduced sentence. A few years after his release, he was caught again with 400 pounds of marijuana and sentenced to another 20 years. The Medellin cartel held on to its market share into the mid-80s, but everything was about to change dramatically. In places like the Bahamas, a new super-potent form of smokable cocaine first appeared. It became known as crack.
The first time I saw crack was in 1983. What struck me was the fantastic high that these young men and women talked about. They described it as having 1,000 Christmases. Another description was having 100 orgasms at one time.
A smoke of cocaine, in 8 to 10 seconds, it goes straight to the body, straight to the brain, and immediately you get that feeling, the instantaneous feeling of being in a different world.
But the other thing was it produced a powerful ethical fragmentation. People from very good families who had no qualms about stealing, no qualms about selling their body, no qualms from any kind of sexuality, from bestiality to what have you.
I thought myself as being too good to go to work. I didn't need to go to work. As a matter of fact, the money derived from crack sales, that was sufficient to sustain me. But little did I know that the same crack was going to bring me to my knees.
There was one particular cocaine dealer as well as user, and he was admitted to the hospital because he also had diabetes. He went into diabetic coma. And I remember sitting with him when he died. And his last words to me was, and this was in '85, he said, "Doc, when the world knows about this drug, there's going to be a lot of hell out there."
And a new beginning. Life renewing itself in the depths of the forest. It's an hour before dawn, early in May. A yellow warbler has reached landfall at Long Point in southern Ontario. Reaching south into Lake Erie, Long Point draws in the travelers crossing the water. Many are neotropical migrants on their way from Latin America and the Caribbean. They've been riding the storms, pushing north as fast as they can go. Located roughly in the middle of the continent, Long Point offers food and woodland cover, a rest stop for exhausted, hungry birds. Researchers have been studying the migration here for more than 30 years. counting and putting bands on the birds to track their numbers and their destination. John McCracken, Long Point Bird Observatory.
Since 1960, we've banded over 280 different species of birds here, and that encompasses about 325,000 different birds.
Gently disentangled from the fine web of a mist net, the bird will be taken to the field station for study. Billions of songbirds traveling thousands of kilometers. Studying the migration is like trying to catch the wind. But work done here over the decades suggests that this great current of life is waning.
We've looked in depth at 56 species. These are some of the most common species of songbirds breeding in the forests of Ontario. About 75% of them are declining and have been declining since 1960. The majority are neotropical migrants.
Is the magnolia warbler?
Magnolia warbler. Sorry,
Volunteers from all over the world work in the field stations here. They attach numbered bands to identify each individual bird. Its vital statistics are noted beside its number.
J.A. QDA. Okay, so it's second year, which is 5-1.
5x1, 4x1.
Almost 500,000 birds counted and measured. It's a record of long-term trends in the migration.
71.
Beneath the breast feathers, reserves of fat show through the skin.
A 2.
Fat powers the immense journey. This bird has been refueling for the next leg.
.4.
Long Point isn't the only place that's trying to measure the migration. Most of the neotropical migrants cross the Gulf of Mexico, a 10-hour non-stop flight or more, depending on conditions. The trees of High Island on the Texas coast pull them in like Long Point with promises of food and shelter, a place to rest and wash the salt off their wings. In nearby Galveston, the weather radar station picks up a different kind of cloud in early spring. It's made of birds. Ornithologist Sidney Gautreau uses these images to monitor the migration.
The reason we're picking up birds is the same reason we're picking up weather. Water is a tremendous reflector of radar energy. It bounces the signal that it receives back, and the radar picks it up and it shows an echo on the radar screen. So the very moisture that we're getting in raindrops, you might think of a bird as being a very big raindrop. And hence we can pick up birds readily with weather surveillance radar. And obviously birds in a flock give a very distinct reflection. And so these flocks of trans-Gulf migrants can actually be picked up when they're still 100 miles offshore if the atmospherics are right and the beam can pick up the targets.
The numbers are staggering. At the migration's peak, around 50 million songbirds cross the coast every few hours. But it's just a shadow of what it once was.
When I compare the radar films gathered in the 60s with films gathered from coastal radar stations in the late 80s, there's a 50% reduction in the number of trans-Gulf migrations.
Where's the problem? Is it in the south or on the breeding grounds in North America? Males arrive first to choose a nesting site and proclaim it in song. In one day, this vireo may sing 20,000 times. Springtime is like a clarion call in the northern forest. Every living thing seizes the moment to ensure the next generation. It's a short season for everyone. Food brings the songbirds here, the insect hordes of spring. Longer days make time for the exacting tasks of reproduction. Every species has a precise nesting strategy, building and placing the nest according to thousands of years of natural selection. Some, like the red-headed woodpecker, hide their nests in cavities. Yellow warblers build in small trees and bushes along the woodland edge. The northern oriole hangs his nest from the end of a branch, while behind the screen of fresh young leaves, the wood thrush crouches, motionless, alert for danger. Incubation is usually the female's job. Snuggling down, the yellow warbler fits a patch of warm, bare skin to the clutch. She shed her belly feathers just before laying. Hatching time is 12 to 14 days. Once the chicks are hatched, the forest buzzes with parents searching for food. And it's no coincidence that there's a lot to find. Insect larvae hatch out to take advantage of nutritious young leaves. The songbirds take advantage of the larvae. The beaks gape automatically, but a reflex stops the chicks from swallowing too soon after the last morsel. Any caterpillar that doesn't go down is moved along to the next beak. "10 days from now, these chicks will leave the nest. Development that fast needs a lot of fuel. During those 10 days, the yellow warbler parents will glean 1,200 caterpillars. The forest needs the songbirds just as much as the songbirds need the forest. Their breeding success is crucial to the forest's health. The nesting season is short and intense. There's very little margin for error. But around the little world of the nest, the larger world is undergoing massive change. Half an hour before dawn, beside a suburban building site. It's not the most propitious place for a bird count. Of course, it wasn't always a building site.
Okay, tell me when you're ready.
Okay. Go.
Song sparrow. 2 barn swallows.
Bob Curry and Kathleen Gardner are volunteers in a continent-wide census called the Breeding Bird Survey. Since 1965, it's been tracking changes in bird populations on 2,000 routes across North America.
This route has changed considerably over the 25 years. Originally, it was, I dare say, picked because it was out in the country and went through a series of farm fields and then up into some mixed forest. Now, a good quarter to a third of the starting sites are being taken over by urban sprawl, by houses, sewer lines, and traffic, and so on and so forth.
Stop.
Each route is 40 kilometers. On their annual count, volunteers stop every 800 meters for 3 minutes to record the birds they see or hear. All the records put together show what's happening across the continent.
Killdeer.
This survey has shown a decline in migratory songbirds at breeding time.
and maybe five bobolinks.
But the patterns are hard to grasp. Like the rest of us, volunteers like Bob Curry see just the local situation.
3 red-winged blackbirds and 2 rock doves.
In the complex world of birds,
And a couple of mourning doves going over.
all he can be sure of is the songs.
Another savanna sparrow. Virtually all of the birds, and now we're talking 250 species of birds, can be identified by subtle call notes or songs. And they, in fact, have different dialects and different songs to serve slightly different purposes. But as I say, with time, experience, and desire, you can learn them all.
Ready and start.
Okay, rose-breasted grosbeak.
Many species of neotropical migrants are declining.
And indigo bunting.
It's been blamed on the loss of tropical forest. But species that never go near the tropics are also in trouble, like the white-throated sparrow. The problems vary from species to species, right across the songbird's range.
It's our first one today. It's a nice stop. And a catbird.
The boreal forest, the great mantle of trees that wraps the continent's north. This vast wilderness, rich in plant life, swarming with insects, is the breeding ground for untold numbers of songbirds. Untold numbers, because who could count them as they disappear into an ocean of green? 3/4 of the birds here are neotropical migrants, but we know almost nothing about their relationship with the forest.
Maybe you can get a couple.
This team is recording the number and the distribution of birds in an area of boreal forest in northern Ontario.
It's up this Highway 652. I think there's
Dan
5
Welsh
points in
from the
there.
Canadian Wildlife
Down
Service
Haddle Lake
has
Road
been
over there,
directing this
an old
study
jack
since
pine,
1989.
and then also in an older poplar stand as well.
Far from an endless sea of green, the boreal is a mosaic of distinct habitats, many different forest types classified by vegetation and age. The yellow-rumped warbler is in a mixed deciduous area, hardwood trees on well-drained soils. Birds are counted at 620 stations in a study area of 10,000 square kilometers. It's one of 6 survey sites across the north of the province. Andrea Kingsley stands for 10 minutes at each location, noting down every bird she sees or hears. That's a black and white warbler. That's the song of a magnolia warbler. The bay-breasted warbler is singing in a stand of black spruce, where Chris Spitz is doing the count. That's a ruby-crowned kinglet. These studies have shown something new. Songbirds choose their nesting habitat here precisely, preferring certain types and ages of trees. Each piece of the boreal mosaic is a community of many different forms of life, exactly fitted for each other.
The boreal forest is in fact composed of many different types of forest stands, and the species of animals that live there, particularly the birds, are very closely associated with them, so that forest spruce stand with deep sphagnum mosses it has a characteristic group of species or a bird community, and we could just as easily listen to the birds from that area and know what kind of forest it was as we could to go and look at it. If we were to go to a drier site, then it would have its own group of species, and mature hardwood stands, mature mixed wood stands, all would essentially have their characteristic communities associated with them.
More than 1 million square kilometers of the Canadian boreal are labeled commercially productive. Most of it is under license for logging. When we remove the forest, we replant trees we want for timber. If the mosaic becomes a monoculture, will the birds find their breeding habitat? Will the forest survive?
The most important thing, in my opinion, that we have to do if we're going to manage the forest properly is to start to recognize what the components of the forest are and to think about the whole landscape. We have to recognize that it's a mosaic composed of different types of stands and of different ages. And if we tinker with that unwisely and forget to keep some of the pieces, then we're really going to have problems. These highly evolved bird communities need the type of stands that they're associated with. There's so much that we don't understand about what makes some sites rich and others poor, and what the role of birds is, or what the role of various insects or soil microorganisms might be. And I think we've got to be really humbled by the complexity of it, and while we recognize that we're going to use it, that we've got to use it wisely by trying to keep all of the bits that are there.
Raising a family is hard enough in the best of circumstances.
How's it going, man?
Pretty good. Richard Holmes from Dartmouth College is studying nesting success in the Hubbard Forest north of Boston.
You see where it is?
In this large, relatively undisturbed area, the nests are subject to heavy predation. Like everything in nature, birds are part of the food chain.
Trying to understand what causes changes in these migrant bird populations, we've come down to the fact that predation is a very important factor affecting reproductive success in these species. And to try to understand predation, we've done a number of experiments with these artificial nests where we've put out the nests in different places, tried to assess where predation is most severe, and also who the predators are in this system.
These studies have shown the intimate connection between songbirds and the forest's natural cycles. The bait, a fresh quail's egg, triggers the remote camera. Caught in the act, a raccoon, a fisher, black bear, a blue jay, and a red squirrel.
It turns out that with the squirrel and chipmunks being the most common predator, their fluctuations are really quite important, because when they're abundant, they have a major impact on the bird nesting success. When they're scarce, then the birds do very well. And it turns out that the squirrel and chipmunk numbers are related to the seed crops in the trees. That when you get a good seed year, you get a lot of squirrels and chipmunks surviving over the winter. Then the following spring, when those seeds are now gone, they then turn to birds as an alternative food supply during the next summer.
Abundance and scarcity. These cycles have always affected songbirds, but squirrels, blue jays, and other predators have increased with human settlement, while the birds they prey on have fewer places to hide. From a bird's eye view, this looks like someone else's habitat. The original forest cover has been reduced to fragments. Some songbirds prosper in this fractured landscape. Generalists like the grackle, which eats almost anything, including birds' eggs. The crow is thriving, and so are birds of the open country, like the indigo bunting. But most songbirds need the forest. In the bottomland forest of southern Illinois, Jeff Hoover braves heat, insects, and poisonous snakes to discover how breaking the forest into fragments is affecting the birds. 900 nests are being monitored in the study funded by the Illinois Nature Conservancy.
It's a wood thrush nest about 5 meters away at 272 degrees and about 6.5 feet up in a spice bush.
Hanging on till the last moment. When the wood thrush finally flees, a strange sight is revealed. Beside 2 sky blue thrush's eggs lies an alien third. The egg it replaced isn't hard to find. These are the culprits, brown-headed cowbirds. This songbird has evolved a reproductive strategy that's adding to the pressure on many other species. As their name suggests, they live alongside cattle, feeding on insects stirred from the grass by hooves. Once, they followed different hooves through other grasses. They were called buffalo birds then, following the bison herds across the prairies. Perhaps that's why they began to be brood parasites, laying their eggs in other species' nests and moving on. Once the bison were killed, the cowbirds moved east as the forests were cleared. They found abundant food and settled in. Now, there are millions of them, all looking for someone else's nest. It's worked out well for them, not so well for other species. One female can lay 40 eggs in a season, each replacing several forest songbirds. It's a covert operation. When the wood thrush turned her back here, she lost an egg and gained another, but she didn't know it. She'll go on laying while the cowbird keeps watch for further opportunities. The thrush may end up raising more cowbirds than thrushes. Forest birds are losing out to an enemy they can't recognize. In Illinois, 65% of the nests being monitored